Christian nationalism, as I've presented it, is incompatible with secularism. If Christians get serious, then yeah, we're a threat. I mean, we're a threat to their regime.
Greetings, I'm Douglas Wilson. I'm here with Stephen Wolfe. Stephen has got a book coming out with Canon Press, The Case for Christian Nationalism, which we're going to talk about. Welcome, good to have you here. I've turned in a manuscript to Canon, which they say they're going to publish, called Mere Christendom. And one of the things we're going to be doing is discussing whether these are adjacent projects, overlapping projects, the same project. What are we talking about? So the Case for Christian Nationalism. Could you summarize what you're doing and why that term?
Yeah, so I think first the big question is what does it mean? What's the definition? The common definition used today, it's actually a term of derision. It's something that's negative. It's bad in itself. The definition itself makes it bad. And so the question is, why kind of appropriate? Why use this term in the first place?
Right.
And I mean, the impulse of a conservative nowadays is to kind of reject whatever the left says you are. But as I thought about Christian nationalism, I think, well, you know, I love my nation and I'm a Christian and I want it to be Christian, a Christian
Chocolate,
nation.
peanut butter.
Yeah, so it seems to fit together. And I think that the term Christian nationalism makes sense as if you're going to describe, you know, a Christian nation kind of acting for itself for its own good. So that's my very basic definition. It's just a Christian nation that is kind of self-conscious of itself as a Christian people. And they're saying to themselves, we want to arrange ourselves, order ourselves for our good. And that good includes not just the good of the temporal life, but also spiritual life or heavenly good as well. So then they arrange themselves to those ends.
Accordingly.
Yeah.
So let's start with break out the definitions. As Christian, you're operating out of the Reformed Presbyterian tradition, right? So Christian would include all the basics, Apostles' Creed, confession, the basics of the gospel, the historicity of the death, burial, and resurrection, all of those things. That's Orthodox Christian, not whitewash Christian or veneer Christian or nominal Christian, but the real thing, believing it.
Right. I mean, there's an element of, I mean, I do argue for cultural Christianity as well. We can get into that. So I think there will be, in a Christian nation, there will be like a nominal Christians or hypocritical people. But it's the as a whole, the nation as a whole will identify itself as a Christian nation. And yeah, and those they will affirm the standard doctrines of orthodoxy.
Right. So you're not talking about an etiolated Christianity, liberalism, or anything like that. You're talking about the historic Christian faith.
Right, historic Christian faith, it's a Protestant project, and one of the benefits of Protestantism is that we can differ on some secondary issues, and still affirm each other's mutual faith. So a Presbyterian, a Baptist, an Anglican, they may debate important points of theology, but they can affirm each other's brotherhood in Christ. And for America at least, part of the project is to say, well, we can have a sort of pan-Protestant political order. We can see ourselves as Protestants, taking the Protestant faith and identifying with that as a nation together.
Part of the reason we know that that's possible in the future is that we did it in the past.
Right. Yep.
There was a time in our history where we really were a pan-Protestant nation.
Right. It was a very self-consciously Protestant nation, and you can see it reflected in the founders. And certainly there were founders who were not Orthodox, but the denominational backgrounds of the founders was very diverse, and then America, of course, since the founding was very religiously diverse in the 19th century, but at the same time it was widely accepted among Americans that we were a Christian country.
So when I was a boy, I remember being led in prayer the beginning in the government school, being led in prayer by a government employee. We opened the day in prayer, and prayer was the last thing to be driven out of the schools. Dabney warned that Bibles, prayers, and catechisms will ultimately be driven out of the schools, and we think there were catechisms in the schools. And the early wave of Catholics, the reason Catholics formed their own parochial school system is not because our school system was secular, but because it was so Protestant. It was Protestant catechisms, Protestant Bible, so on. And so in living memory, the last vestiges of that were driven out. And so the question arises, well, how did prayer ever get in to the school system? Well, it was from that Christian consensus, right?
Yeah, it was like I said, it was a self-conception of being a Christian nation. And there was also that self-confidence that we are a Christian people and we ought to catechize our kids within public institutions. Religion is not something to be privatized. It's not something to be left just for the home or just for churches. That we as a people see the good, not only for eternal life, but also for just temporal life. It's good to have a religious people. A well-ordered soul will ensure a well-ordered body politic. And so that was well accepted until recently. And it's weird it's hard for people to imagine that in public schools because so few people still have that memory of that. But just a few decades ago, it was well accepted, and it would be odd not to have it like public institutions that are part of discipling children in a certain sense in the faith.
So we've defined Christian. We're talking about the historic Christian faith in the Protestant stream. That's what we're talking. That's what you're arguing for in this book. How would you define the nation part?
Yeah. Now this is definitely the trickiest part. This is also the part where you're easily misunderstood. And I think we should say at first that concepts or things that are difficult that you can't define with precision or identify with precision. You should not expect anything more than what that term can, or that concept can. The precision, you shouldn't expect more precision than what that concept can actually handle.
Defining a nation is harder than defining a triangle.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
yeah, thank you.
right.
Yeah. And I think in each set of circumstances is going to be different. So in some places it's very clear that this people in this spot have been here for centuries or millennia.
Like the Japanese.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's just it's clear that that the nation is very much a relation of blood.
Right.
But I think just in our own experience, the way I approach it in the book, I call it a kind of phenomenology of place. The way I approach it is, how do we, that as we go through our life, we can identify with other people based upon similarities in culture and a national history that we've all participated in, and that allows a lot of difference between different cultures. People identify different dress, different music, but we've all taken part in this national life for a long time. And we can talk about the same events in history, as our same history, struggle as our history, even though there'd be differences. I mean, in the past people kind of talk about maybe kin groups that you can kind of separate between kin somewhat, somewhat of a relation of blood. But what I'm not saying that every nation is simply a relation of blood. That right. Every nation is something that comes from people who are related as sort of like biological cousins. But a nation is people who are very different bloodlines, different ancestry, who have a common experience and have a commitment to this place that they live.
And that common experience would include things like language, it wouldn't be exclusive, but it would include things like language, culture, diet, geography, history, so forth.
Yeah, I think a test is really, if a certain people are being attacked, who's going to just join together and who's going to fight that aggressor? Right. Who's committed to this place, this spot of earth, despite differences in some culture and accents, and who's going to sign up and who's going to take arms to defend this place? So that's just one example of, if that's true for you and that's true for these people, then they are a nation. In some ways, that's a nation in formation. Oftentimes, national struggles come to form kind of a sort of ethnogenesis. Right. But I think that's at least in an early form. If you are a people who are going to die sacrifice yourself for this piece of dirt.
So according to your definition, America is a nation.
Yeah.
Okay. And if we dialed down, if we zoomed in the biblical strict sense of ethne, the Navajo would be a nation. We could speak of the Navajo Nation or something like that, or tribe. But if you zoomed out, even in biblical times, Paul was a citizen of Tarsus, and he was a citizen of Rome, and he was of the tribe of Benjamin. So you have layered allegiances or layered experiences.
Right.
Right. So if Rome were attacked, Roman citizens would rally, and if your city were attacked, you would rally. And so the term is, when Jesus said to disciple the ethnoi, he's not leaving empires and local tribes out. There's a range, right?
Right. That's right. So I've been in the military, and you have people who are very, very, who love the state and town that they came from. You think of a Texas boy who really likes Texas, can't stop talking about Texas. They even call him Tex. And yet he signed up for the national military to go fight for that country. And I mean, in a sense, he's fighting for Texas. He's fighting for his parents. He's fighting for his friends. But he's also fighting for the nation itself.
What flag is over his unit?
Yeah, right. He has the American flag on his shoulder, and next to him could be someone from Puerto Rico, right. or someone who's from Puerto Rico, lives here, or from Puerto Rico itself, and they would be same foxhole, firing back, same American flag on their shoulder. So even though that kind of broadens the notion of kind of an ethne of a nation, it still shows that there is there's a sense of kind of, this is our land, this is our place, and we're going to join the foxhole together to go fight for it.
And so with that definition, or with that commitment to that being within the range of what you're talking about, that prevents someone from saying that Christian nationalism is simply a dog whistle for white supremacy.
Right. I mean, that's false. And so it's not trying to, it's not some means to bring back some sort of white supremacy or white order. It's just identifying what is true on the ground, what is true. So instead of applying some kind of racialist principle, instead of some abstract ordering notion, just what does experience tell you on the ground?
You're playing cards with the hand that we're dealt.
Yeah.
This is what we have,
right? And
this is what we should be loyal to, and this is what we should receive with gratitude.
But it's not just that, but that, like, your nation and your ethne, it's something that it's not something like just an abstract term that you can just define and then start breaking up different people groups.
Right.
Because we live in places with others, and we have, like I said, we have similar experiences, we have similar language, we have similar interests, similar goods in mind. We all have a commitment to this place itself. So just in your experience itself, like, who are your people? Well, it's the people you go to the coffee shop who look different than you, and you say good morning and they say good morning back. It's these people who are your nation.
And the dissimilarities that exist in a nation of north of 300 million people across a continent, you're going to have a number of dissimilarities also, regional and linguistic and so forth. And because you've got this commonality, you've got a commitment to work it out, talk about it,
right?
Work it through.
Yeah, I mean, and I could talk about that a little bit. I mean, this is one reason why I talk about immigration a few times in the book. This is one reason why we should be really concerned about mass immigration. It's not because of the sort of people who are immigrating to the country, but then in a country like the United States that is already very diverse, who's already trying to sort out like, who are we? It's one of those enduring questions, especially for the last 100 years, is what do we say when we say we? And so I think that this is one reason we should kind of limit immigration, is that we can sort out kind of who we are, that there can be intermarriage between different people, and we could come to, these people share this place, this nation, this history. But if you have a lot of new arrivals, you have people who need to be kind of brought into that, or they're not brought in at all. And so that's one reason why I kind of oppose. I think we should put a major halt on immigration, just so we can kind of sort things out,
right,
and have that ethnogenesis, that we become a kind of a securely solid.
So you're not objecting to immigration streams, but an immigration flood means that we can't assimilate and we can't define, right, and we can't accommodate.
Yeah, it's not a matter of like maintaining white people or maintaining. It's a matter of, we need to have a genesis, as I've said, that brings us together as a people, and that takes time. It takes generations. It takes intermarriage. It takes it takes a common, a commitment that says that this is our place and we have nowhere else to go. That right. This is and to kind of, and also to see each other in a very, very reciprocal way. That you were born here, I was born here. My father was at this same piece of dirt, working in this factory, working in that store, alongside your father. So we have those intergenerational connections that bind us together into a place.
Right, now let's move to maybe I would call it a Christian objection, an objection from Christians. I think it's actually a Gnostic objection, but Jesus erases all that. Right? If I love Jesus and you love Jesus and he loves Jesus, then where you live, where you came from, what language you speak is absolutely irrelevant. In your book, you talk about, let's talk about grace perfecting nature, okay, or grace erasing nature. How would you talk about that?
Yeah, in relation to this, the topic of kind of cultural difference, I think that the grace, it doesn't destroy nature, perfects, you could say it restores nature, but it doesn't make everyone the same. The grace does, the content or what's packaged with grace is not this new language that we can talk, that somehow someone from a foreign country now can speak the gospel language. They're going to use their own language. They're going to be, preaching is going to be in their own language. The Bible is going to be translated in their own language. And they're going to understand each other in that language. And I mean, it's extremely common in the Christian tradition to say that, I think it was Augustine who said that if you don't know the language of another guy, someone else, then you're worse than dogs in understanding each other. Like for humans, language is so fundamentally crucial for understanding each other that if you don't have any overlap in language, you can't do anything at all together. In fact, you're just going to be hostile to one another, or at least frustrate what you're trying to do. So you need, so in other words, it cannot be the case that simply being a Christian is enough for you and another person to cooperate in civil fellowship and civil life and achieve the sort of goods that you could if you all knew the same language. Mm-hmm. I mean, because civil life and politics it's a sort of project. It's an ongoing project, and it requires deliberation. It requires analysis, assessment. It requires you just talking with people. It's a matter of sharing surprises, sharing wonders, talking about contemplative things. It's more than just, can you work together on a factory floor? And in order to do all that, you need to have the same language.
Okay.
So I mean, and again, grace does not supply that language.
And so let's talk a bit about natural affection. The Bible says, honor your father and mother. It's the first commandment with a promise that your life may be long on the earth or in the land Lord your God is giving you. Does that include your grandparents? and your great-grandparents?
I think, yeah, I think Fifth Commandment, it covers all this sort of relationships that people have, from natural affections to civil relations, to even relationship to your pastor. So I think it covers all hierarchical relations and equality and equal relations as well. But I think natural relations is really important. I mentioned earlier that if your grandfather worked with some other guy's grandfather in the past, or let's say they both participated in a war, you have that connection, even though you may have no kind of blood similarities. You were both in that place doing something together, and so you have that. Even though you don't have natural affections directly for that other person, in a way you have it indirectly. So your grandfather worked with his grandfather, and through that, then you have that connection with that other guy. And in a way, it's a natural affection. And so that's why I keep saying, like, the nation it takes time, because then these natural relations you had for your kind of blood ancestors actually then kind of permeate out into the people themselves of that nation. And that's how you form that togetherness.
So you're sitting next to someone on the plane, and he mentions in passing that his great-grandfather fought at Guadalcanal.
Yeah.
And your great-grandfather fought at Guadalcanal. You're going to bring that up.
Yeah.
You're going to say, oh.
Right.
And so no one is maintaining that those incidental or natural relations, affinities, and connections are superior to the bond we have in Christ. Right. So if someone from another country entirely loves Christ, and I do, and I'm talking to a fellow American who hates Christ, I've got more in common on the ultimate issues with the fellow Christian and not with my countrymen. Right. So like the Apostle Paul was persecuted by his kinsmen. They hated him, wanted to kill him, but he said he'd go to hell for them. He loved them, according to my kinsmen, according to the flesh, even though he had more in common with Titus, who was a Gentile.
Yeah, so I think that there'd be two very different people who share the highest good, which is sharing eternal life in Christ. That does have a sort of commitment to that other person with regard to that good, that highest good. But even in sharing the highest good, like you say, more in common with someone, that person you have more in common with is someone you'll be able to participate in civil projects in the body politic for the sort of temporal goods,
right?
That you would not be able to procure or to with the person who you just share. You only share the highest good, because again, like in order for you to achieve these temporal goods in life, you need cooperation. Cooperation requires some kind of communication. If you lack that means of communication, if you have nothing but sharing the highest good, you can't actually accomplish that.
Yeah, so I might have the ultimate destination of heaven that I share in common with someone whose language I do not speak, whose customs I do not know, whose projects I'm not interested in. You know, all of that's true, and vice versa. And so we couldn't function together in a day-to-day life and still acknowledge that the ultimate good is something we share. But I can't function with them unless we work out a shared language or a shared project. Okay.
Yeah, but just take. I mean, we're in a building that's under construction. If in a building where you have construction, if one person's manning the saw to cut the wood, another guy's hammering, one guy's gonna have to call out measurements. You're gonna have to know. So you have to have that language of measurements, and so that's just a basic point where if you don't have even that commonality in language, you won't be able to complete any sort of project of that.
One thinks of the Tower of Babel, for example.
Yeah.
A building.
Yeah, that's exactly
a building project. The Lord interrupted by the simple expedient of mixing up the languages. Okay, let's talk about a political thought experiment here. I'm thinking of Quebec and in Canada, and Puerto Rico, statehood for Puerto Rico. Okay, so I would be concerned about and opposed to admitting Puerto Rico as a state, but have no problem accepting Puerto Ricans as Americans, fellow Americans, and so on. but I'd be opposed to statehood because it's like an IQ test. This doesn't match. It doesn't fit linguistically, right? And I think something similar with Quebec and Canada. You can do it. You can put a snail in the salad, and some people like it. But but as a long-term project, would you say when the Canadian project was formed, would you say a French-speaking province is a great idea and it just shows the cosmopolitan nature of man? Or would you say, I'm kind of dubious about whether that's a long-lasting thing? The same kind of thing with Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I mean, I think in Canada, I think it points to the fact that a lot of modern nation states are sort of small empires in a way. There can be different nations and peoples within the same nation state.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's good or bad. In fact, my book is not a defense of nation states, so I really don't have any problem with a sort of empire like that.
If you pull it off.
Yeah, if you can pull it off, and I mean, often they do pretty well. It's usually a lot of times in like empires, like a smaller people or smaller country, they get the protection of the empire. If they're all by themselves, you're taking over. So
a boutique empire.
Yeah. But I do think that in the example of Quebec, they should have, they do, some lawmaking authority so they can order themselves according to their own customs. So if you do have a nation state that has different, you want to say different cultures or nations within, I mean, all this language makes it difficult, but that there should be, or there can be, some lawmaking authority so that you can establish yourself as a people, as a distinct people within that sort of nation state. And Puerto Rico has that as well. So, and I think, I mean, apart from the question of whether it should be a state or not, I think at the very least, Puerto Rico, it's good that they have their own like quasi-autonomous government, so that because it's a very different, very kind of different place that they can order themselves as they see fit.
So let's talk about the flip side of this. If we're advocating for Christian nationalism, and as I hear you talk, it seems like very much the same thing that I've been advocating for under Mere Christendom. Mere Christendom being larger, Mere Christendom involving multiple nations that have a shared commitment to Christ, but distinct boundaries. Mere Christendom. But you're focusing on the cover of the book is the outline of America. Is Christian nationalism. You're focusing on our heritage, our history, our past. So this is a compatible sort of thing. I'm wondering if we have the same shared rejection of the secular project, the secular liberal project that wants to pretend that there's such a thing as religious neutrality.
Yeah, I mean, whether there is or not, I don't, religious neutrality, I don't want religious neutrality. Like I said, in a Christian nation saying that they're Christian, and the ism of nationalism, of Christian nationalism, is them saying we're Christian and our institutions are going to reflect that fact. And it's sort of self-confidence. So I think in America what we need is we need to look to our history, which is that we are, the recognition of that we are Christian with Christian institutions, and be self-confident in that and assert that. And I think we just lack that self-confidence to assert that. And it's it's a complicated situation with Constitution and interpret the Supreme Court and all that, of course. But just at the very basic, we have to say no. This is who we are, and this is what we want. And we can't be so uncomfortable with the use of civil power for that end. I think this is, when I talk to people about, just the other day I was talking to someone, I said, yeah, a Christian nation is a nation acting for its own good, for heavenly and earthly good. Like, oh yeah, I like that. And then I was like, well, this means a civil power is going to enforce that. And then that's where they're like, oh, whoa, civil power. You can't do that. But that's what I'm saying, is that we should have Christian magistrates and Christian governments that enforce Christian norms. on the public, in the public, and also ensure that public institutions such as schools are Christian as well.
Okay, so take in the public space, in the public realm. Just a few years ago, I believe it was Switzerland that did not allow minarets, Muslim prayer towers. Church bells are fine. Church bells are fine, but Muslim prayer towers, which are sort of broadcasting in the public space, you're talking about that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that would be right. That would be Christian national. Yeah, so it would that's not to say you wouldn't allow mosques or synagogues, that sort of thing,
To exist.
Yeah, to exist. I mean, I'm not talking about suppressing that sort of thing, but yeah, something that's public like that, that would be inappropriate for a Christian nation to do that. I mean, I should say that I say in principle you can suppress that. I mean, if the Christian people want to allow that, they can. I think it would probably be imprudent. Because what I'm not saying is that every Christian nation has to look the same. We're all very different. The American tradition is much more tolerant than others. And so as Americans, I'm not saying all of a sudden we're going to, put heretics to death and all that. But there are some basic things we can do for our society through government that would enforce Christian norms.
One of the features of Christian civilization is that Christians invented the idea of religious liberty. Religious liberty is not a value that percolates up out of every worldview. The Muslim Brotherhood doesn't have that value at all. Saudi Arabia doesn't have that value at all. And we do, but it's a vestige from our Christian heritage, and we're seeing that the secular now that the secularists are making an aggressive move, we see that tolerance and free speech, that's not a value in their system. And to the extent that we want free speech and genuine liberty, we need to have structure and form that can only come from Christianity, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is an important point that the idea of religious liberty is, it's not just Christian, I'd say it's also very Protestant. There was the Protestant Reformation, even Calvin, notorious Calvin also said that the conscience it's free. It ought to be left free from the state and prying into minds and saying, do you affirm this, do you affirm that, and force people to, Christian truth and becoming a Christian is a matter of persuasion. It's a matter of one person speaking truth to the other and then assenting and trusting that, trusting in Christ. So it cannot be forced. You cannot have a law that says you must be a Christian. And that's not just because it's imprudent, and it's not just because it won't work, it's because it's wrong in principle. Right. And so no Christian nation should ever have a law that forces people into conversion.
Right.
But from that, over centuries since the Protestant Reformation, there was this recognition, especially among Protestants, as I mentioned earlier, that look, we're all Christians and we can all actually get along in the body politic. So in the book I talk about the sort of evolution that occurred from the 17th century up to the American founding, the relationship between the Congregationalists and the Baptists in New England, where over time there was a lot of problems between Congregationalists and Baptists, but eventually Cotton Mather, the famous Congregationalist minister, is now preaching an ordination sermon for a Baptist in Boston. And so you see this evolution that occurred and this recognition, so we can actually get along.
We can work it out.
We can work this out. We don't have to be persecuting. And
the American version of the Westminster Confession, in 1789, when they revised the British Westminster is much more robust on the authority of the magistrate in theological affairs. But even the American Westminster talks about how the magistrate is not to play favorites between churches of our common Lord.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the American settlement.
Yeah, and in the early, the concern in New England wasn't that, hey, these guys aren't Christians. Even when the Baptists were there and they were kind of suppressing Baptists, it wasn't, oh, these guys aren't Christians. I mean, the Quakers were goofy; they didn't think they were Christians. But the Baptists, they did. They were affirmed by the established churches. Yeah, you're legitimate, but we don't want you to have your own churches for baptism issues, and I don't go too far into that, but they did recognize their mutual faith, and they said, okay, Baptists, you can actually join our churches. You just can't start your own. But because of conflict, as I said, they eventually said, hey, we can all get along and have our own churches. So I think that we as a Protestant country can have wide tolerance, but still say, no, we're not just a religious country. We are a Protestant country, and we're going to order ourselves according to that.
Do you think that secularism, the American form of secularism, is in trouble? Do you think they're...
I hope so.
We're trying to make trouble for them?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Christian nationalism, as I've presented it, is incompatible with secularism. If Christians get serious, then yeah, we're a threat. I mean, we're a threat to their regime, in the sense that us Christians having power would end that regime. It would end the secularist regime, and there would no longer be religious neutrality, which actually isn't the case, of course, that they enforce their own social dogmas upon us that are quasi-religious. But yeah, it would be an overthrow of the regime. I'm not talking about overthrowing the government. I'm not talking about overthrowing the state. I'm talking about the regime as in the people who kind of control the forces of our society.
It's a genuine threat without being an anarchist bomb throwing threat.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I'm not calling for someone to go shoot up something.
But you have written a book that licked your forefinger and you went up to touch the giant's eyeball. Yeah. He might have an opinion about that, right? I know that the ARCs of your book are circulating, and there's buzz about it. What do you anticipate being the central pushback from let's say from fellow Christians, conservative evangelical Christians? What do you think the central pushback is going to be?
I think people who are of good faith, who are not just trying to call it racist or whatever, I think they won't like the idea of using civil law to kind of suppress heresy. I think that's one thing. They don't like blasphemy laws, and I think in general the mindset of an evangelical is that the only thing that's Christian is you can't really have a Christian government. You have Christian churches, you have Christian individuals. So it's going to be this way of saying there's only those two things can be Christians. You can't really have a Christian nation. You can't have a Christian government.
There's no such thing as a Christian nation. They
right?
Would say.
Yeah. It's fake. It doesn't. It can't exist in principle. Yeah.
But the objection to blasphemy laws. This is one of those inescapable concepts. Every society has blasphemy laws. I could go out to Friendship Square here and get arrested within 15 minutes on the basis of what I was saying alone.
Yeah.
Right? Because we don't call them blasphemy laws. We call them hate crimes or that sort of. We have a different terminology for them. But no society can exist without an acceptable realm of discourse. Right? You're not introducing something new. You're simply saying, I would like the definitions to be better.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. So that there should be, there's always going to be social dogma. There's going to be, like today we have social dogmas instead of religious dogmas, and like I said, they're kind of quasi-religious. And I think those can be replaced, or I guess added to those would be that you don't blaspheme God, and if someone does, that they should be suppressed in some way. I think that the problem with that is that Christians don't get offended by that. Christians get offended by a lot of things that their fellow secularists also get offended by, and those are the things they actually get offended by the most. In a way, as a sort of performance to their secular neighbors. I think a lot of the outrage Christians express publicly.
They take offense on behalf of
Yeah,
their unbelieving
they express.
neighbor.
Yeah, it's like a sort of witness. Look at our morality, and then as a witness to secularists, because they care about these things. But Christians don't care that someone will publicly. They don't react when someone will like publicly blaspheme God in public square or in movies or anywhere. They don't care because there's no like a lot of things will trigger their anger, but not the things that actually concern God.
So one of the things that we might want to point out is that if we followed your argument and you were persuasive and we were to introduce this state of affairs, and they would object if we allow for blasphemy laws, then America would become a totalitarian hellhole, right? And so I would say, well, were we a totalitarian hellhole in 1778 or in 1790 or in 1850 when Supreme Court decisions upheld blasphemy convictions, right? So no, our founders fought for freedom, and we were a free country. It was, Old Glory is wonderful. But the thing that I'm proposing is that we return to that. It's not America becoming a Christian nation. It would be America becoming a Christian nation again.
Yeah, I think it's having the will to assert that through institutions, through society and institutions. I think the problem is that there's an old kind of old line that in politics, the people who win are the people who care the most. And I think conservatives in general, they lose because they don't care. I mean, they seemingly care. They listen to talk radio, they watch Fox News and all that. But they're not the ones running local school boards. They're not the ones who actually have power, and they don't care. But I think Christians should care, and they should care in a way that is for the good of Christian truth and for the good of the church.
Now, how would you answer someone who says they would grant the point, yeah, America had blasphemy laws in the 18th century and in the 19th century, but you yourself pointed out how Cotton Mather learned to get along with Baptists. We did make certain adjustments, and we learned some things, and why couldn't that be one of the things we learned?
With like non-Christians?
Yeah, look.
Or become
some atheists
essentially evolve into secularism
right.
or whatever. Yeah.
Can we have a tolerance for a little more tolerance than would have been granted in Calvin's Geneva?
Yeah, I mean, we get more tolerance than that, but
of course,
and we did, of course. But once you go from this pan-Protestant order to this jump to this pseudo neutrality, you've essentially eliminated the highest good from the civil society. So it's not a movement in prudence. It's an abandonment of principle.
And so this pseudo neutrality, this pretended neutrality, is not going to simply allow for the moderate Muslim who doesn't believe in the Trinitarian God. You're going to get drag queens in the school library. You can't. There's a direct line slide from one to the other.
Right. So I mean, in a pan-Protestant order, as I'm presenting it, doesn't mean that you persecute or you discriminate people who are of non-Christian faiths. Doesn't mean you're doing anything to Jews or Muslims or even to atheists. But Christians do not need to say, okay, well, our society has those people, therefore let's end this as a Christian order. It's no longer. We don't have to implement this neutrality. And when you do, I think that, as you pointed out, it's evident that you get insane moral dogmas, social dogmas that are then enforced upon you as a sort of doctrine. Basically, what we're witnessing nowadays is like a sort of religious impulse. It's people who have abandoned religion, who have a religious impulse, who are now using the powers that God has ordained. God ordained civil power, and using that power to enforce just absurdities.
So the fact that you lose God doesn't mean you've lost your impulse to go on crusades. Right.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so you the COVID crusade or the climate change crusade or they're oftentimes driven by a moralistic frenzy, and it's a religious sort of phenomenon, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is just good old like Vogelinian or Eric Vogel, the idea that these people, when you abandon religion, when you become very atheistical in principle, you don't lose that religious impulse. It's just channeled in politics, and it's so disordered that you do. I say in the book that in a way leftists are right in that people ought to use the powers of government for good ends. They just have a
bad definition.
A bad definition of what the good is. I mean, like really destructive and absurd notions. But Christians should say, yeah, in a way the left is right and we've been wrong, in that we should see power as something ordained of God, and something to be used for good. Why would we retreat and abandon that? Why would we be afraid of something that God has ordained for us, for our good, to give it over to people who have such disordered loves that they can't recognize the difference between man and woman?
Have you always been? Did you come to this realization one day in the shower 2 years ago, or have you always been? Have you been on a low simmer your whole adult life, or was there a moment of where look?
You know what? It was just after thinking about like Christian nationalism. It's like this. You know what Christians need is they need the recovery of that will to establish and use the power of that God has ordained for their good. And we've become so weak and so kind of passive with regard to these things that we've let these moral absurdities just kind of take over and reign over our country. And I think that we have the people, we have the numbers. It's just a matter of convincing people to have the confidence to act. Right. And so that's why I like the term Christian nationalism, that there has to be a sense of the nation saying enough. We're going to take back what this nation, and restore it in a way to what it once was. So that's really what kind of inspired me, I guess, in the shower to say, right. We can do this.
But looking at your book and as I'm reading it, it's very tightly reasoned. It's very careful and methodical. So it's not, when you say take America back, I think you're deadly serious about that. But it's not a red, white, and blue flyer, superficial, take America back. Just you don't want to turn back the clock 20 years. You're wanting to get down to the foundation.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a nostalgic book. It's not about, hey, I want to get back to the Reaganomics or get back to the liberalism of the 90s or the compassionate conservatism of the foreign adventurism of the early 2000s. But yeah, we need to look to the past as an inspiration. I think back into the 19th and 18th centuries and beyond, but also recognize where we are today and move into the future.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.